Clichés, stock phrases, catchwords, stereotypes, whatever one wishes to call them, exist so that someone who hasn't thought about a subject can secure the immediate agreement of another who hasn't thought about it either. Wherever you hear or read one of these marvelous substitutes for thought, you can be certain you're witnessing an encounter between two hearts propping each other up, reinforcing one another without the slightest interference from the object they pretend to be discussing. For example, when someone says, left and right are outdated concepts, what he really means is, I am above such things. The listener promptly replies, so am I. And off they go, delighting in their superiority, while the two allegedly non-existent forces continue to vie for power, insult one another, sabotage each other, and even exchange gunfire, as if they actually existed. The truth is that no fact or thing in this world, however small or modest, can be grasped through the language of clichés. These clichés have nothing to do with the description of reality, but serve, at best, as expressions of harmony or discord between the souls of the speaker and the listener. This is so for the simple reason that no reality comes with a ready-made language attached to express it. In every case, discovering it requires inventing the proper language to convey it. That is why the authors of great discoveries in philosophy are also inventors of original languages. Depending on each one's literary talent, those languages may be clear and crystalline like Plato's or Leibniz's, or abstruse and cryptic like Kant's or Heidegger's, but always original, unique, and tailored to their purpose. The cliché is, par excellence, the language of self-deception attempting to transmute itself into the deception of others, ideally, into general deception. It is the speech of someone who shuts their eyes to the object and opens them wide to watch the listener's reaction. The poor object, the topic, the matter at hand, remains outside the conversation like a beggar peering through the window of the Ritz. If we return to the previous example and, instead of joining in the delightful harmony between speaker and listener, turn our eyes to the actual object of the conversation, in 100% of cases we'll notice that it bears little resemblance to what is imagined by those who didn't even try to imagine it, only using it as a pretext for social exchange. Right away, if there are people who identify as left-wing or right-wing and who act politically under those banners, it's evident that left and right exist as real political groupings who recognize themselves under those names and distinguish insiders from outsiders by them. If we were to discard those terms, we'd have to replace them with others of our own invention, terms those two groups would not recognize and which would only serve to complicate the vocabulary. As self-designations of political groups and symbols of their identity, the terms left and right are in no way outdated. They express an undeniable sociological reality. It makes a bit more sense to say that their respective ideological discourses have been outstripped by the increasingly complex development of circumstances, which neither fully captures. Have we thereby outgrown the concepts of left and right? Not at all, for that claim is the very accusation that the left and the right endlessly hurl at one another. And if we fail to notice even that, it means we're more ignorant of the situation than either group, and it is we who are outdated. The self-proclaimed wise man reveals himself as a fool at the very moment he tries to pose as superior. It ought to be obvious to everyone, yet for many it remains an esoteric secret that the good or bad quality, the truth or falsehood of a group's ideas has nothing to do with that group's existence or non-existence. Arguing that leprechauns don't exist does not prove that there are no groups who believe in leprechauns. Even more foolish is the one who claims to scorn all ideological rhetoric and instead examines only the malicious material interests behind the apparent clash of ideologies, imagining himself, by that alone, firmly grounded in facts and immune to illusion. But first of all, pointing out the material interests behind an ideological discourse is precisely what opposing ideologies do to one another. And they do so almost always rightly, because every ideology, as Karl Marx once defined it, is a garment of ideas, Ideenkleid, stitched to cover a material interest, a power project, a worldly ambition. Furthermore, it is certain that if these interests presented themselves naked and unadorned, without ideological packaging, they would be immediately discredited and fool no one. Ideology, therefore, is an integral part of the malicious project, which cannot be understood apart from it. Finally, it is also certain that, once formulated, an ideological discourse serves as the verbal symbol of a group's identity, and without that identity, the group would lack the means to act collectively. Thus, the content of that discourse will never be completely unrelated to the group's actual conduct, which will in some measure be forced to align its power ambitions with the promises and values articulated in the discourse. The tension between group identity and the material interests at stake is a permanent element of political ideological life, and to abstract ideology, in order to focus solely on isolated material interests, is to condemn oneself to a complete failure to understand them. A characteristic example is today's most fashionable cliché, according to which Mr. Lula is neither a communist nor a leftist, but merely a politician without ideological affiliation who became illicitly wealthy. This cliché is pleasing across various parts of the ideological spectrum. For the leftist, it is a magical formula that absolves the PT's political current from all guilt for its crimes. The current that created him, exalted him, granted him hegemony, and, should he fall, intends to remain in power under other names. For the right-winger, it offers a powerful rhetorical weapon. See how no one on the left is any good, how they're all crooks and scoundrels. And for the man who is above ideologies, it's one more confirmation of his sublime superiority. Thus, all these pretexts serve those interested in looking good by omitting at least two questions. 1. If Lula is just a petty thief with no commitment to communism, why did he distribute so much money to communist dictatorships and parties when he could have simply kept it for himself? 2. Why did the FARC honor him for having saved continental communism in extremis, rather than accuse him of using communism for personal gain? To believe that Mr. Lula is merely a selfish little thief with no ties or commitment to international communism is one of the stupidest and most indefensible notions ever conceived by the human brain. On the one hand, there is the incontestable fact that he is accepted and celebrated by all communist governments and parties around the world, not only as a loyal partner and brother, but even as a kind of hero, a providential savior. If he reached this status without doing anything for communism and always acting solely in his own interest, then he managed to deceive all the communist leaders and governments of the planet, including the secret services of Cuba and China, reputed to be extraordinarily efficient and cunning, while somehow failing only to fool the superior discernment of Brazilian media commentators. On the other hand, there is the equally incontestable fact that no schemer has ever managed to exploit communism for personal gain without benefiting, even more, some communist government or party, at least not without paying for it with their life. Willy Munzenberg, who was a million times cleverer than Lula, was merely accused of trying to do that, and was assassinated before anyone could determine whether he had or not. It is humanly inconceivable that a movement which sentenced 100 million people to death would generously spare the life of a swindler who humiliated it before the entire world. Even less conceivable is the idea that, after such a humiliation, that same movement would continue to praise and pamper him, as do the governments of Cuba, China, Venezuela, etc. That hypothesis is so absurd, so monstrously implausible, that believing in it, even for a minute and in secret, would already be proof of colossal imbecility. The naive ease with which so many people in Brazil trumpet this idea, without the slightest inhibition, is the ultimate proof that something is deeply wrong in the national brain. Monumental errors of this kind do not appear in isolation. They stem from a structural, profound, and scarcely reversible ignorance regarding the nature and function of ideologies in general. The guesswork artists who overpopulate the media and academic chairs imagine ideology to be something like a religious belief, one that demands deep and sincere adherence of the soul. From this perspective, a communist, for instance, could be either a true believer or a mere opportunist with no belief at all. Such a distinction may have existed in earlier times, when the USSR handed down the tablets of the law and condemned Trotskyists, revisionists, etc., as heretics. In fact, there can be no true believer without a canonical text that is binding for all. It's been at least 3 decades since any of that has existed in the communist movement. The ecclesiastical conception of the party as the guardian of infallible doctrine was replaced by the flexibility of an unlimited pluralism, where all ideological discourses are acceptable, so long as their adherents agree to act according to a unified strategy. At the same time, the old vertical hierarchy was exchanged for a more flexible organization in the form of networks, where directives no longer descend from the Olympian heights of a central committee but spread almost anonymously, as if they were mere demands of common sense rather than orders from comrade so-and-so. The replacement of ideological unity with purely strategic unity, conceived in the 1980s and spectacularly tested during the Chiapas guerrilla movement in Mexico in 1994, hence called the postmodern guerrilla, allowed the communist movement not only to survive and scathe the fall of the USSR, but to multiply its strength and capacity for action. The global left today is far more unified and organized than it was 60 or 70 years ago. It has gained in joint operational power what it lost in ideological debate. Anyone who fails to perceive this does not deserve to be listened to when it comes to politics. To make things even more incomprehensible to the enlightened sages, there remains the fact that left and right are only symmetrically opposed entities in dictionaries. In real life, the left today is not an ideological label, but a unified and highly organized movement with no defined ideology, whereas the right is, at best, the name for a confused amalgam of disconnected ideological discourses, with no corresponding organization or unified movement even on a national scale, let alone a global one. They are not species of the same genus. One who conceives of them as such in order to appear superior to both, like a circus performer riding two horses with one foot on each, is in reality an impossible acrobat with one foot on a flesh-and-blood horse and the other on the abstract concept of a hypothetical horse.